Welcome to episode 3 of I Thought I Knew How, a podcast about knitting and life and all sorts. I'm your host, Anne Frost, and this episode was recorded on February 23rd, 2019. Today, I'd like to do something a little different and share with you the trip I made to Shetland in July of last year. I'll share the whys and wherefores of my trip and what I learned from the experience. A couple of musical artists from Shetland have graciously allowed me to showcase their music in this episode, so stay tuned for that too. If you'd like to get in touch with me, you can email me at ann@familypodcasts.com. That's Ann with an E at familypodcasts.com. The show notes are available at ithoughtiknewhow.familypodcasts.com, and you can find the show on various social media platforms, including Instagram and Ravelry as I Thought I Knew How. There is also now a group on Facebook and a Twitter account under the name of @ThoughtIKnewHow, with no I at the beginning because it was too long for Twitter. So you have myriad ways to reach out to me now, and I really hope you do. There have been several kind comments so far about the podcast, and I really appreciate hearing from you. I knew as I started the podcast that I wanted to do an episode about my trip to Shetland. It was a game changer for me. I got to work drafting the episode last week, and normally an episode outline runs about 6 pages, but my first draft for this episode hit 11 pages before I finally stopped myself and realized I was going about it the wrong way. There's no way I can share everything about Shetland. I cannot take you along with me to every site I visited, and I cannot do Shetland justice in 30 to 45 minutes. So I started over, and you have to please forgive me for just giving you the highlights. I'm going to focus on the knitting-related sites I visited and the major points of Shetland's history with knitting and touch on the main techniques employed there. I do have a product review related to Shetland. I will review 2 of the yarn shops. I have a personal essay. Like I said, there's some music coming and a few book recommendations. So it is going to still be a very packed episode, but what I will try to do is in the next few days, I'll release a bonus episode where I quickly cover a few of the other things that I really would like to tell you about and just don't have time to in this episode. So in case you are thinking of going, I will share some other sites I went to, some of the restaurants I loved, and just some general travel tips that I think would help you as you're planning to go to Shetland. And even with that bonus episode, I'm still not going to do the place justice. I loved it so much that I very sincerely want to move there. And my long-suffering husband, who can work from anywhere, is not opposed to the idea. So we are actually planning to visit together in September so he can see what it's like. And then he'll go home and I'll get to stay for Wool Week. Hopefully all of that will go according to plan. No one is sure when knitting first made its way to Shetland. The first example of knitted fabric that has survived the ages was found in the early 1950s. The items were worn by a man who had died somewhere around 1700 and whose body and clothing was preserved by the peat he was buried in near Gunnister. So he's often referred to as Gunnister Man. He was wearing knitted stockings, gloves, a hat, and carrying a knitted purse. However, there's no evidence that the knitted items were actually produced on Shetland, so scientists who study this sort of thing are reluctant to say that knitting has been there since 1700. Gunnister Man could have come from elsewhere, as there were many people coming to Shetland at the time for fishing and trade. However, as the earliest surviving example found on Shetland, it's the earliest knitting we can say for sure that Shetlanders would have seen. So at least by 1700s, Shetlanders had been exposed to knitting. Now, as I was reading up on this, I saw that Shetlanders were involved in trading knitted items to the Dutch before then. So that would tell me that knitting was in place, but maybe I have my wires crossed on something. The original clothing worn by Gunnister Man is kept by the National Museums of Scotland, but if you are willing to drive to a very remote corner of Shetland Island, you can visit the Tangwick Haw Museum. And when I say it's remote, I mean that there are miles and miles of single-lane roads to get to it, And not only did I lose cell service along the way, but my phone's GPS stopped working as well. That said, it was a gorgeous hour or so drive to reach this little museum that was full of military history and vintage clothing and items, and of interest to us, a modern recreation of Gunnister Man's knitted goods. It's one thing to try to make sense of the originals from black and white photos taken in the 50s, and quite another to see recreations up close and personal. There are other museums that have models of Gunnister Man wearing recreated clothing, but those tend to focus on his entire outfit and usually end up hiding the knitwear. So those with a hardcore interest in historic knitting are definitely going to want to make the drive. At the end of the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, the economy in Shetland did quite well with trade and fishing. The Dutch and others would come to Shetland to fish the waters around the island and would trade the local people for vegetables and meat and knitted items, mainly stockings at that point. But in the early part of the 1700s, some political issues arose that disrupted the good thing that they had going. When the dust settled, a form of tenant farming had taken hold called crofting. Crofters had between 5 to 12 acres of land each to make their living every year and were expected to pay rent to the landholder. In reality, crofting work was not enough to support a family. Typically, the husband would leave to fish for several months each year, and the wife and children would run the croft without him. Even so, his income from fishing also typically wasn't enough for the household, and so women turned to knitting to help bring in additional cash. I began to grasp all of this history during a visit to the Croft House Museum. The docent, a very kind woman named Barbara, gave me a tour of the Croft House. It's a one-story building divided into two main sections, one for the animals and one for the people. The human area was subdivided into 2 rooms. The actual house was lived in until the 1960s, but now that it's a museum, it's set up to recreate what it would have looked like in the mid-1800s. There was yarn and a work in progress in the main room, as well as a hap stretching frame. Hap is the local word for a shawl, and you can imagine that living in a 2-room house with all your family members having to do their thing and animals just on the other side of a door. Blocking a lace shawl inside would have been next to impossible. There are photos of Shetland shawls being blocked directly on the grass outside using pegs driven into the ground, but even that would have been difficult to accomplish with children and animals around. So the solution they came up with were large wooden frames made up of 4 long boards with pegs every few inches around the top of the boards. They could then sew through the edge of the shawl and around the pegs all along the side of the frame. Once the shawl was in place on the frame, it could be leaned up against a wall or moved around the yard to catch the sun. A similar solution exists for sweaters, incidentally. Rather than pinning a washed sweater back into shape on a flat surface like we do today, Shetlanders use a jumper board made from wooden slats that stand upright, wide enough to stretch the sweater body into shape, and with slats that stand straight out from the shoulders that draw near to each other toward the wrist to hold the sleeves in the proper shape as they dry. They could be freestanding and just stand on the ground or hung from the rafters out of the way. You still see jumper boards in use today outside some people's homes, but you're sure to see them in action in many of the local museums too. And it is very hard to get your hands on a new jumper board. I tried. They are in super high demand. I was really impressed by the simple genius of these blocking methods, but it made sense as I listened to Barbara explain the level of knitting trade going on by the mid to late 1800s. Shetland knitters were individuals working within a major industry, and not only were they trying to produce as many sweaters and shawls as they could for sale, but shawl buyers would return the shawl to the knitter periodically to be reblocked. They needed ways to do it quickly and safely. For a long while, Shetland stockings were in high demand, but in time they grew less popular. Shetland knitters turned their attention to knitting fine openwork shawls instead, and as I said, they grew in popularity towards the later half of the 1800s. But of course, the crofting women of Shetland didn't have a way to get their shawls to the world market, so merchants stepped in, and rather than paying them cash for their knitting, they paid them in goods. And this was called the truck system. Of course, The merchants were able to acquire the goods at wholesale prices that they then traded to the knitters at retail prices. So they were able to turn a tidy cash profit in the markets to the south. Over time, rather than having a diverse selection of goods for the women to trade for, the merchants settled on tea as their main form of currency for buying these knitted goods. And when you're being paid in tea, and your neighbor's being paid in tea, and the women down the road are being paid in tea, you can imagine that it becomes nearly impossible to find someone on the island who's willing to buy your tea for cash or trade you for something you really need. Eventually, the women of Shetland acquired the reputation of being voracious tea drinkers, and families were essentially locked into poverty. The government passed laws to prevent truck like this, but given the distance from London, the system lingered in Shetland far longer than it was allowed. In 1921, then Edward, Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VIII, was depicted wearing a Fair Isle sweater, and this style, which had been worn in Shetland for several hundred years by that point, became a hot fashion trend. The popularity of Fair Isle has waxed and waned since then, but the fact that it continues to come back strongly into popularity over 100 years now says a lot about its general appeal. Fair Isle knitting has come to mean a lot of things to different people. The original standard was that it was a form of stranded colorwork knitting that used no more than 2 colors per row and typically didn't carry the color along the back for more than 5 stitches at a time. The most traditional forms of Fair Isle use sequences of X and O shaped motifs of different styles and Piri patterns or little designs that could be fit between rows of the larger X's and O's to add length and visual interest to the overall garment. The Shetland Museum and Archives and the Shetland Textile Museum, as well as many of the other smaller museums around Shetland, have excellent collections of both Shetland lace and Fair Isle knitting. And that, my friends, is a very brief and very incomplete history of knitting on Shetland. And I cringe to think what some devoted Shetland knitting aficionados must think of that overview, but I'm working largely off my memory of the trip from 7 months ago now, and under the constraint of having to fit it in the time that I have on the podcast. If I made any glaring errors, please let me know. You can email me at ann@familypodcasts.com. That's Anne with an E at familypodcasts.com. I am really interested in this stuff, so don't be shy about kindly correcting me. We are going to take a break now and listen to a song by a group of Shetland teens who play traditional music as the band Fjanna. You can find them on Facebook by searching for Fjanna, Fjanna, or visit the show notes for this episode at ithoughtIknewhow.familypodcasts.com for links. This song is a live recording, but that's half the fun of it. Pick up your wires and knit a few rows. I'll meet you on the other side. back up and talk some more about the Shetland Textile Museum. I'm guessing many of you know about the Shetland Textile Museum without realizing it. A photo of theirs went viral last year of a strip of lace fencing that Anne Unson knit using fishing twine for the yarn and curtain rods for the needles. The museum itself serves a dual purpose, teaching about the building itself, which served as a bod, or sort of a employee area, processing area for the fishing industry, and also housing an absolutely exquisite collection of historical Shetland knitting. In my memory, most of the knitting, other than what you could see in the shop, was all upstairs. I could have that wrong, but that's how I remember it. When I went, in one of the upstairs room, there were 3 volunteers knitting Fair Isle sweaters using knitting belts. And that's when my mind was blown. If you've not seen a knitting belt before, the center of the belt is a leather oval pad stuffed with horsehair with holes poked all over the surface. It's maybe 2 or 3 inches wide and 6 or 8 inches long. This pad has thin leather straps attached to each side that you use to wear it around your waist, and then you have the pad sort of slid over toward your right hip. The project you're working on is cast on with very long double-pointed needles. They're about 16 inches long. And then, whether you're working a project in the round or knitting something back and forth, the end of the needle you typically hold in your right hand is stuck into one of the holes on the belt. You still stabilize the other end with your right hand, but if you need to use your right hand for something while you're knitting, like to grab another ball of yarn or a cabling hook or stir a pot or to get a child in line, you can let go and your knitting will still stay in place because one end of the needle is secured in the belt. They are a genius invention for knitters who are having to knit in the small moments around all the other work they have to get done, like the women of Shetland historically had to do. If you knit by throwing the yarn with your right hand, then you can knit using a knitting belt as you normally would. But because the weight of the project on the right hand needle is carried by the belt, your hand is far less fatigued by knitting. One of the volunteers who was there, a lovely woman named Pat, talked me through what she was doing and then jumped up and put the belt on me and let me have a try. I never realized how much work my right hand was doing as it supported the project and went through the motions of knitting until I tried the knitting belt. I was immediately sold on the concept and made sure to pick one up in the gift shop downstairs before I left. The next day I swung through a yarn shop in town and bought every set of every size of the longer DPNs that they had in stock to take home with me. You can easily find your own knitting belt online, but the long knitting needles can be harder to get your hands on. Or if you can find them, they can be very expensive. I would say if you can find a belt in the range of $50 or so and the needles as a set of 5 for around $7, you'd be paying about what you'd pay if you picked them up in Shetland. Now you're getting them, most likely, listening to this, you're getting them in a different country and there might be different import duties and stuff. So shop around and make sure that you're getting a good price. If you're hesitant to take the plunge at that price point, I really encourage you to look for an opportunity to give a knitting belt a try at a knitting event. I feel like every fiber arts event I've been to has had at least one vendor there selling them, and I really think you'll enjoy it if you try it. But not only was I introduced to this amazing bit of knitting technology, the room that I was standing in was chock full of some of the most impressive specimens of knitting I have ever laid eyes on. In one case, there was a collection of Fair Isle work that illustrated the different ways knitters through the years have applied the technique to changing fashion trends. There was a pattern, a printed pattern or an advertisement on the wall that showed a Fair Isle dress that just looked amazing. And if I had the patience and the skill, I think I would attempt one because I think the effect of a Fair Isle dress would just be so impressive. But to me, the true stars of the room were the examples of lace. There were several glass cases that had navy blue backing to better show the handiwork in the white shawls, and rightly so. As someone who still has to concentrate when working anything more complicated than a basic feather and fan pattern, the examples of Shetland lace shawls were nothing less than heart-stopping. They are even more impressive when you realize that the lace motifs were passed from knitter to knitter without writing out the instructions or charting them. I am simultaneously astounded by what these women were able to create and pass along to others, and embarrassed that I am clearly not working up to my own potential. The Shetland Museum and Archives, which has its own impressive collection of Fair Isle and lace pieces, is currently involved in a project to research, chart, and name the motifs involved in the surviving examples of Shetland shawls, and I can't wait to see the results of their work. I simply will not be able to do these shawls justice on an audio podcast. They're too diverse in design and intricate in pattern, so I will provide links and photos in the show notes and encourage you to take a look for yourselves. Rather than running with a sponsor this week, I'd like to call your attention to the Shetland MRI scanner appeal. They are trying to raise £2 million to buy an MRI scanner for the Gilbert Bain Hospital in Lerwick, Shetland's capital city. I'm going to just read a bit from their website. Over 600 patients from Shetland will travel south to have an MRI scan each year. MRI diagnostics are used to diagnose and monitor a wide variety of conditions, and the number of patients who need them is steadily increasing. There can be delays in getting an MRI scan due to bad weather, transport delays, and logistical problems in getting short-notice appointments or one-stop clinics. There is also the challenge of making the journey itself, which can involve time off work and impact on family life and childcare at an already difficult time. Despite their fundraising efforts, as of this recording, they have raised only 5% of the needed £2 million. If you listen to the bonus podcast that I'm going to post later, I will cover what it was like trying to get to Shetland in bad weather when I was healthy. I can't imagine what it would be like to have to make a trip like that when I was worried and unwell. Please, if you are able to donate to the cause, visit shetlandmriscannerappeal.com. On the top right of the page, you'll see an orange donate button. Give what you can. If you can't give outright, consider following Shetland MRI Scanner Appeal on Facebook and keep your eyes peeled for their various fundraising efforts. Perhaps one of them will line up with a need you have, and you can contribute to the cause that way. Even sharing their posts with friends might help connect them with someone else who is able to help. Thank you for anything you can do to help them reach their goal. Before I proceed, I'm going to warn you. The following is the personal essay for this episode, and it is sad. This brief interlude into grief is essential to the story of my experience with Shetland, so I'm going to tell it. But if you want, you can skip ahead until you hear the next song, and I won't hold it against you. So, why Shetland? The start of 2018 was incredibly hard. We wrapped up over 8 years of life in the Philippines and moved back to the United States to help my aging mother. We arrived just after Christmas in 2017. My mother was living in a nursing home and was still anxious to get out and about. We were able to pick her up one time and take her on an afternoon adventure, but it was very difficult for her, and we questioned the wisdom of doing it again. A week or so later, she began to show signs of actual decline, and we knew that it would not be wise to try to move her in and out of the car. She died on April 6th. It was just her and I when the time came. I had been by her side for most of the last week of her life, and then I had to handle the end-of-life arrangements. Luckily, I have a very supportive husband and several other friends and family members helping, who put things together for the funeral, but I was shattered. I wish I could say it was a blessed event and inspiring and that I was honored to be there for her at the end, but I am not that enlightened of a person yet. It was heartbreaking and traumatizing, and I got to the point where I felt like my emotions were radiating through my skin. You know how in cartoons sometimes before something explodes, the frame will just show the object surrounded by color and they draw all these rays of light shooting outward from it for a second or two and then it finally erupts? That is exactly how I felt as I walked around my daily life, like I was stuck in that light projecting, about to explode state, and that at any moment I was just going to explode into a grief mushroom cloud. After several weeks of life like that, I knew that I needed to go somewhere else. I needed to get away from my family and my commitments and just let the explosion happen. The process of trying to keep it together was making it worse. A friend of mine from my time in the Philippines was planning on spending a month in Scotland over the summer, and I called her and said, "Hey, I'm going to meet you in Scotland, but I don't want to infringe on your holiday with your family too much, so I'm going to spend 4 days alone in Shetland while I'm there." And she said, "Cool," and I said, "Cool," and I started planning. So why Shetland? I honestly don't know. As soon as I resolved to go to Scotland, it just was automatic that I was going to go to Shetland too, and that was that. I never questioned it. I knew that Shetland was connected with knitting, and I like to knit, and I knew that it was remote and one of those places that if I didn't go see it while I was already on a trip to Scotland, I probably wasn't going to get to see it, but really at the time, I had no reason to go. I had no idea what Shetland was like, if there was anything there for me to see or do. Honestly, I kind of hoped there was nothing to see or do given my state of mind at the time. I didn't know what accommodation options there were. I literally knew Shetland was a place, and that was all. So I started to do my research and found that yes, Shetland is a place, and I could get there. And there were places for me to sleep and things to do and really nice sounding restaurants and culture and sheep and puffins and open, empty spaces. And that's what I decided I wanted to go for. I went for those open, empty spaces because I wanted to brood. I wanted to stand alone and let the explosion happen and shake my fist at God and not worry that I would be too broken up to get the kids moving the next day or get my work done or face what other commitment needed to be met. I wanted to look out over a stark landscape and think sad thoughts and just be there and embrace the sadness. But I'm also an obsessive planner when it comes to travel, so I made a list of all the things to do on Shetland in case I wasn't ready to face things for a day or two when I first got there, or if I cried myself out and wanted something to do. I wanted to make sure I had options. And I had a lot of options. I was surprised at how much there is to do on Shetland. By the end of the first day, I had visited 6 sites on my list, checked into my Airbnb, walked to a grocery store, made dinner, and went to bed. You know, I'd just gotten there. I'd met and had very pleasant conversations with a few people that first day. I had to get situated before I could let the explosion come. The next day I got up and did my rounds in town of the yarn shops and a couple of museums. I had some lunch, drove to a few more distant sites in the afternoon because it was so sunny and lovely out. Along the way, I had several more kind conversations with people who didn't know I was in mourning, so they didn't treat me with kid gloves. They shared their knowledge with me, they joked. Even in minor passing interactions, there was a kindness. By the late afternoon, I decided to head across the bay to Bressie because, again, I was there to brood and be sad and explode and feel feelings, and so far I'd been failing miserably. Now, I certainly wasn't walking around Shetland in a state of rapturous joy, but I had effectively been able to avoid facing my feelings at all, which was the whole purpose of getting away on my own. So far, my trip had been full of calm and kindness, which, while I was engaged in avoidance, that calm and kindness had served to take some of the edge off. I felt less raw. Bressie is, I guess, what I would call a residential island at this point, within less than a 10-minute ferry ride from Lerwick. It's not highly populated, And the spot I wanted to visit, an old churchyard on the north of the island, was very remote and surely would be a great spot to have an emotive breakdown. I figured I would go and be there and return, and it would take about 3 or 4 hours, and then I could have a late dinner and go to bed while there was still some light. Because, given that we're so close to the Arctic Circle, it's light well into the evening there in the summer. So I made the crossing, and right by the dock, there's a visitor center. So before I set off for the churchyard, I popped in, and who should be there but Barbara from the Croft House Museum the day before. She was there working as a docent in the visitor center. We had a bit of a chat, and she offered to give me a lift to the kirkyard if I waited 10 minutes or so for her to close everything up. I was so glad to see her again because she'd been so informative the day before, and I was so happy she offered to drive me. I mean, come on, I was there to go to a remote spot and brood and be sad and cry, but I could still get a ride and do all those things once I got there, right? Barbara got me to a spot as close as the roads would allow and pointed me in the right direction and sent me on my way. I don't know if she will ever hear this podcast, but if she does, Barbara, thank you. Honestly, meeting you and experiencing your openness with your knowledge and kindness and car were a highlight of my trip. I had about a half-mile walk to the site at that point that took me through wide open sheep fields, a lot of Shetlands given over to sheep. I made it to the old kirkyard. There was not much left other than some grave markers and an outer wall. The yard rises on a little hill to one side that is actually an Iron Age structure called a broch, which was buried by time. That spot, though small, had been used as a burial site for literally ages. The Bresse stone was found there, a memorial stone to a Pict chieftain's daughter named Nadad. A replica has been erected in the yard, but the original is in Edinburgh and dates from the 9th century. So there I was, stood in a centuries-old churchyard surrounded by graves, looking out over a bare landscape with an expanse of blue sky overhead. The only other structure nearby was an abandoned croft house. The only living creatures I could see in that moment were sheep. Surely this would be the place to give in to the sadness. But it had been such a treat to see Barbara again, and she'd been so kind to drive me out to my destination. And the sky was so blue, and the wildflowers were in full bloom. It wasn't the time to be sad. It was so beautiful. I stood in the corner of the churchyard and was surrounded by the generations who had lived their lives in that same landscape. Those who'd built the broch and buried their children, those who came along and unknowingly chose the spot again to bury their own loved ones 1,000 years later. All these people who had laughed and loved and been buried beside their loved ones, and the church was gone and the broch was buried, but they were all still there. Even in that empty landscape, life was actively moving on around me. The flowers and the sheep were there, and off the coast a few small boats had come out, and I could hear the people talking back and forth to each other. And I just stood there and absorbed it, the cycle of it, the unity of experience through the generations. And for the first time in months, I felt like I was taking in an experience instead of projecting my sadness outward. And that's when the tears finally came. There in the churchyard without a church, with no one around to offer comfort, but life all around me. The crack formed in my emotional stronghold. Only instead of sparking an explosion, it triggered a flood. I'm not sure how long I stayed there. I don't think it was too long. I cried the emotions out and took comfort in the wind and the voices of the sailors, and the sheep eyeing me, and the flowers and the clouds, and remnants of lives lived decades and centuries ago. This was not a cry it out and be done with it end of mourning moment. On the contrary, it was the first moment where I felt like I gave myself permission to fully embrace mourning on its own terms. I stopped fighting it. On that stretch of the Bresse coast that was simultaneously empty and full of life, I finally found the space I needed to just let the sadness come. And it was not accompanied by railing or cursing or throwing rocks. It came with the support of the ages. Eventually, I decided I needed to head back to the ferry. It was a long walk, and I wasn't completely unburdened, but I felt like a lot of the weight I'd been carrying had been passed to the shoulders of the ages. I was present again, and the morning was no longer an enemy I was constantly trying to shove into a cage. The pain of the loss was still there, but it had finally found its corner and taken a seat. I want to make it clear that you don't have to travel to Shetland to learn any of the lessons I learned there. I imagine most could learn these same things standing in front of their own door. What can I say? I possibly have a denser head than most people or a harder heart. The power of place and the liberating weight of shared experience with history can be harnessed on back porches and beaches and supermarket aisles. I am grateful to that little bit of the Shetland coast for being the place I needed when I couldn't let my back porch or supermarket aisle be what I needed. I'm going to take a little break now. Arthur Nicholson is a folk singer from Shetland. He has graciously allowed me to share a song with you. This is Between the Eyes, which you can find on SoundCloud or his website, arthurnicholson.co.uk. Check the show notes if you'd prefer to find a link. This is Between the Eyes.
We have no time to think about it. There's nothing left to be afraid of. It's something different altogether. We met by chance and never parted. Luck played a hand and got us started. Laid out a plan that had to happen. When it hit me right between the eyes, I was taken by complete surprise. It was waiting there the whole time just to hit me right between the eyes. We'll keep a secret not worth telling. It's best not to give away the ending. We just need a moment to be ready. This has so quickly escalated. An almost ideal situation. We would have never had the patience. When it hit me right between the eyes, I was taken by complete surprise. It was waiting there the whole time just to hit me right between the eyes. Don't waste sunshine under the fog. Don't be complacent with your lot. Don't go chasing after the mob. Don't try to be someone you're not. There's no more need for you to worry. We're high enough to see what's coming. We'll gaze towards the next horizon. When it hit me right between surprise, it was waiting there the whole time, just to hit me right between the eyes. When it hit me right between the eyes, I was taken by complete surprise. It was sitting there, just biding time, when it hit me right between the eyes.
A few more things before I go. It occurs to me that I haven't told you about the yarn shops yet. First of all, know that if you are going to Shetland for the purposes of buying yarn, you have come to the right place. Just about anywhere you go has a gift shop, and all of those places typically had knitted items and yarn for sale. You can walk down to pick up some milk at the convenience store and pass 3 places selling yarn. Okay, that part is a complete fabrication, but yarn really is not hard to find on Shetland. There are 2 major producers there who have shops that are easily accessible. The first I visited was Jamieson and Smith, whose shop is a little ways outside of downtown Lerwick, but it's a walkable distance if you're generally a happy walker. The store does not look like much from the outside, as it's a giant corrugated metal building, but it's lovely and cozy inside. It reminds me of a hobbit hole, honestly, but a hobbit hole with walls made of yarn in dozens of colors. Honestly, it's a little overwhelming to see it all displayed. I didn't measure, but I would say each nook on the wall was about 2 feet square and completely full of one color of yarn. They carry notions and patterns and supplies, and they have hand-knit sweaters as well. So if you're there with a non-knitter, have them try on some sweaters while you shop for yarn. I was very proud of myself because I went in with a list of needs for several projects, and I stuck to my list. But that does not mean that I bought a reasonable amount of yarn. I would classify it as an obscene amount of yarn. One of the items on my list was sold as a kit on the website, but when you buy it in the store, the clerk grabs the pattern and pulls the yarn off the shelves for you. It's really quick. I spent about 45 minutes in the store before finally making my purchase. And then I had to walk back to my flat to drop it all off because my arms were full. And then I went on to Jamieson's of Shetland to repeat the process. Jamieson's of Shetland is the second major producer of Shetland yarns with a presence in Lerwick, and they had a storefront right on the high street. When I say they're the second major producer, I just mean they're the second one I went to. I don't know who produces more yarn, which one of the other. All the colors and types of yarn that they produce were in the store in stock, but not necessarily in the proper amounts if you're planning a large solid colored item, which I was. It's a beautiful shop in the downtown, but they don't have as much space as Jamieson's and Smith on the outskirts of town. So they don't have as much space to carry huge quantities of one type. So the clerk got on the phone and made a call to their warehouse to make sure the yarn was in stock there and promised it would be in the shop by opening time the next day. So I carried on with the rest of my list and walked back to my flat with a second obscene amount of yarn. And then the next day I swung back through to get my special order, and it was there waiting as promised. So just keep this in mind when you head to Shetland for yarn buying purposes. Don't leave it for the last day if you're aiming for a large quantity of one color. The Jamieson's of Shetland store also has hand knit sweaters and patterns and notions, but Jamieson's also sells woven woolen goods. So sewers might want to pop in to see their fabric offerings. As I said, this was going to be a long episode. And I thank you for sticking with me. I honestly barely touched the surface of my trip. If you'd like to learn more about the history of knitting on Shetland, I'd suggest you pick up Alice Starmore's Book of Fair Isle Knitting, and then Knitting by the Fireside and on the Hillside by Linda G. Fryer, in that order. The first one will help you lay the groundwork of your knowledge, and it includes patterns, which is always nice. And then if you want to delve deeper into the history, the second will provide you with much more detail. Both are available on Amazon. Alice Starmore's book is generally carried by larger yarn stores as well. If you go to the show notes page and use the links there, Amazon will provide me with a small commission at no cost to you, and you'll be helping to cover the cost of producing the show. If you'd like to hear more about the practicalities of traveling to Shetland and what to do there, keep your eyes peeled for that bonus podcast in the next few days. It will be much more off the cuff and less produced, but I'd love to share more about the trip with those who are interested in maybe going yourself. Thank you for listening and knitting with me for a bit. If you would like to contact me, you can email me at ann@familypodcasts.com. That is Ann with an E at familypodcasts.com. I'm on Ravelry and Instagram as I Thought I Knew How. There is a Facebook group called I Thought I Knew How, and the Twitter account is at Thought I Knew How. We also have a website for the show at ithoughtIknewhow.familypodcast.com. There you will find the show notes for each episode, including links to products I mentioned and ways to support the show. But please remember, today I'm inviting you to consider donating to the Shetland MRI Scanner Appeal at shetlandmriscannerappeal.com. Help Shetlanders get their own MRI scanner so patients don't have to fight the distance and weather to get this basic health test. If you are a musician or know one and would like to have a song featured on the program, drop me an email and point me to